So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leah Cheli. I'm a Florida attorney. In my day job, I work for AAA, the roadside people. So this is kind of my fun that I have. I'm also an LLM candidate at the University of Mississippi Center for Air and Space Law with Michelle. Today, I'm going to review a recent development at the National Space Council regarding regulation of commercial space activities. And examine some recent actions by the Federal Communication Commission, or the FCC, that I think are intended to position that agency to expand the regulatory scope to cover novel commercial space activities. So I'll start by reviewing the recent meetings of the National Space Council that inspired the topic, which centers around compliance with Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty for activities that aren't already regulated by the federal government. I'll review some arguments for why the Department of Commerce, through the Office of Space Commerce, is the strongest contender for this new authority. And I'll touch on the recent reorganization of the FCC's International Bureau, which I think was the FCC's bid to get the National Space Council to notice them for this. And then I'll make a case for why the FCC must play some role, no matter the outcome of the National Space Council's deliberations. So where does this story start? On September 9th of last year, the National Space Council essentially issued an RFP to federal agencies to develop a coordinated regulatory approach for commercial space activities that are not already explicitly covered by another federal agency. Regulators were asked to step up and submit proposals for why they should be selected. The NSC's Executive Secretary Parikh characterized it as mission authorization for novel commercial space activities. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to give you a quick primer on what he meant by mission authorization in the context of the Outer Space Treaty. And a lot of this is going to seem like I'm riffing off of everyone else because I am. So the Outer Space Treaty is unique among international treaties, and not just because it deals with how humans should act once they've left Earth's atmosphere. It's the only treaty that says to the countries that have signed it, including the United States, everything done by one of your citizens or a company incorporated in your country is your responsibility. If something goes wrong, it is your fault automatically. And that's what these highlighted portions of Article 6 say. So there's two parts to it. First, if SpaceX, say, launches a Starlink constellation and one of those satellites hits the Tiangong space station, the American government is on the hook to China for the damages, even if NASA had nothing to do with it. And second, it's not enough that the federal government takes the blame if something goes wrong. The treaty actually goes further and says that the US has to authorize and continually supervise what private citizens and companies are doing in space. Failure to do that due diligence in the authorization part of the mission or to adequately supervise is a separate offense under the treaty. And that's what Executive Secretary Parikh meant by mission authorization for novel commercial space activities. The National Space Council has to fill a gap in the current regulatory environment to make sure the US is complying with Article 6. So this is a big deal for space lawyers and anyone interested in commercial space activities besides launches, which the FAA oversees, and satellites, which the FCC regulates. It potentially adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated regulatory environment. It's another box to check. It's another agency to get a license from. So it probably won't surprise you that this set off a flurry of activity within the federal government and in the private sector. So 2 months after the National Space Council puts out this solicitation, if you will, the FCC announced that it was reorganizing its International Bureau into a Space Bureau and an Office of International Affairs as part of its space innovation agenda. And they casually mention that they've been doing this since 1934. So meanwhile, the NSC held listening sessions to get inputs on novel space activities, innovations happening in the space industry, experience dealing with the existing regulatory system, and potential approaches to Article 6 compliance. Some of you might have participated in those sessions. They scheduled 2, and they had to add a 3rd one due to the overwhelming response they got from the industry. Clarity, flexibility, and predictability in a regulatory scheme were the primary asks from private sector companies operating in space, or planning to operate in space, or planning to invest in or insure operations in space. They also want a more certain, streamlined approach to authorization roles and responsibilities. As anyone who's involved in the US space industry knows, the guessing game that companies go through to cover all of their licensing, export, and other regulatory requirements can be a nightmare for the uninitiated. It's going to keep space lawyers like me and Michelle employed for the foreseeable future, so there's that. So the listening sessions indicated that the Department of Commerce was the early favorite for this role, and with really good reason. So Commerce is already responsible for many of the regulatory areas that are relevant to commercial space. The US Patent and Trademark Office is going to review patent applications for any of these novel commercial space activities if they apply. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, promotes technical innovation and sets technical and scientific standards in the name of facilitating commerce by requiring common units of measurement, performance metrics. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, governs commercial remote sensing, which is satellite imaging and data collection. And then the Office of Space Commerce, which I think Pete had mentioned, which works with space companies to make sure that they're complying with international law and US regulation. So those are all really great reasons why the Department of Commerce is the obvious choice to regulate commercial space activities that aren't already regulated. However, the proposals were due to the White House in March. We haven't heard anything from them, otherwise I wouldn't have anything to talk about today. So I'd like to take a critical look at why I think the FCC really needs to be involved in some way. So this is going to be a little bit of a history lesson here for you. So first, the FCC has been regulating commercial activities with a heavy technical or scientific component for a long time. The FCC was established in 1934, while the Commission has garnered a lot of attention over antitrust and First Amendment issues. Its origins in regulating space activity are probably going to sound pretty familiar to all of us. So when radio communication emerged in the 1890s, it was transformative in people's day-to-day lives. Using the electromagnetic spectrum to send information was revolutionary for humanity. For example, in 1909, 1,200 people were saved when the radio operator aboard the RMS Republic sent the first radio distress signal following a collision with another ship. So it literally saved lives. But it was chaos. It was completely unregulated, and it quickly became apparent that there were a limited number of frequencies that one could transmit over. With no licensing scheme in place, you could broadcast wherever you wanted, at whatever strength signal you wanted, on whatever frequency you wanted. We still call this radio frequency interference, or RFI, and it is still an issue today in telecommunications. During the 1920s, future President Herbert Hoover tackled this problem as Secretary of Commerce, and the Federal Radio Commission was created specifically to address RFI. So the Communications Act of 1934 consolidated the Radio Commission's authority under the broader FCC, and they've been regulating RFI ever since, adding to their mandate as technology and innovation progress. So let's fast forward to 2023. The Space Bureau officially launched on April 11th with a press event to showcase the shift that I think is pretty blatantly directed at the National Space Council to get their attention. The FCC has significant experience and expertise in regulating commercial space activities through its authorization and licensing of satellites and space communications, including the operational and technical requirements, and regulating fledgling industries based on its original commission to regulate radio broadcasting for almost 90 years through multiple phases of innovation and development while encouraging competition. My second argument for the FCC through the Space Bureau, one of the technical aspects of licensing that the FCC took up when it started regulating satellites was a different kind of spectrum allocation, the orbital slot spectrum, where RFI was an annoyance to industry a century ago. Orbital interference, if you will, is outright dangerous. The Space Bureau is already in the business of orbital debris remediation and space traffic management to a degree. The Bureau now oversees the assignment of orbital slots to satellites to avoid harmful interference, which is another Outer Space Treaty obligation. They are already responsible for those aspects of the Outer Space Treaty in that sense. And the FCC has been regulating space objects in the treaty sense since the OST was signed. And there's two considerations here that I'd like to explain. These are a little more common sense than legal arguments, but lawyers are allowed to inject common sense into law occasionally. So first, satellites rule the sky. We will see novel activities and new innovations in space, but communications and remote sensing satellites will make up the bulk of mass in orbit for a long time. Basically, the FCC is already regulating the majority of what America puts into orbit. More importantly, there's a functional consideration here that I think is overcomplicated in a lot of the political discussion. So at their most basic nature, any object that you put into space, whether it is a piece of a Starlink constellation or an orbital construction platform or another novel commercial space activity that's not already regulated by another agency, it's a satellite in the sense that the Space Bureau needs to know where it is and where it's going so that it doesn't run into anything else that they've already licensed to put up. So if it has mass, if it needs an orbital slot, and if it uses the electromagnetic spectrum to communicate, by my definition, that's a satellite. And the last point is really to address those concerns that industry had expressed during the listening sessions last fall. Industry needs clarity, flexibility, and predictability. Commercial space companies have been dealing with the FCC for years. They're a known entity. For lawyers, it's got a long history, lots of administrative decisions that lawyers can look to for guidance. Those decisions are pretty consistent, which is helpful. And it's also about eliminating the duplication of efforts. Right now, it is just duplicative to have any other agencies handle authorization of commercial space. I think between the Department of Commerce and the Space Bureau, the US can cover almost any type of commercial space activity. And if more defined roles and responsibilities is one of the asks of industry, the last thing we need is to inject another federal agency into the mix. All right, so to review, I want to note that the reorganization of the Space Bureau is only the latest move in the FCC's space innovation agenda. Since Chair Jessica Rosenworcel took over, the FCC has actively been trying to make itself a better partner to commercial space. And the National Space Council's request for proposals seems to further galvanize the Commission to make bold moves to position itself as the logical choice for centralized commercial space regulation. In the past year or so, the FCC has also issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, that's how regulations get passed, aimed at expediting satellite licensing applications. It increased the size of its satellite division by 38%, and it modernized its spectrum allocation policies to foster innovation. The most significant thing I think they did was the FCC adopted new rules for deorbiting satellites as part of its licensing criteria, reducing the deorbit timeline from 25 years to 5 years. And this is huge for combating space debris, just monumental. So the FCC has demonstrated the expertise and the desire to make space easier and safer to operate through its Space Bureau. To close out, I think that the Space Bureau of the FCC should be absorbed into the Department of Commerce. The FCC is the only other federal entity in a comparable position to regulate these space activities besides the Department of Commerce. Its role in regulating commercial space is absolutely essential, but it is limited to technological and scientific concerns. It's provided an effective regulatory framework that has adapted to technological changes from transistor radios all the way to telecommunication satellites for decades. The recent establishment of the Space Bureau and the FCC's adoption of these new rules to respond to emerging environmental and economic challenges in space, I think supports kind of spinning off the Bureau, if you will, to join commerce. And continuing to foster the development and streamlining of commercial space regulation. And I don't think that Commerce or the FCC by themselves can provide a one-stop shop. That seems to be the silver bullet that everybody wants, is a one-stop shop, but they've got to do it together. I don't think they can do it by themselves. And we will find out soon enough if the National Space Council agrees with me or not. So, thank you.
Which agency is responsible for collisions in space?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, space traffic management's kind of, I feel like it's a hot potato in the sense that everybody kind of wants to regulate it, but at the same time, nobody wants to regulate it because it's a tremendous responsibility. So I would say right now the Space Force is going to want to get in there, but right now, collisions, I think Leo Labs is the best entity right now for looking at predicting collisions, and that's a private company. So, yes.
How come the commercial space industry say that the regular manufacturers don't get together to support the FCC proposal for space regulation and then put it under the Commerce Department?
Well, executive agencies are not in the business of closing up their own shops and giving away their funding. So I think it's political. I don't think it's a technological consideration or organizational. I think it's about keeping jobs where they are and keeping the current agency structure. So you've got kind of that governmental inertia that's keeping everyone from looking at the bigger picture and maybe compromising in a way. Wes.
Where would this leave the State Department in terms of negotiations and representation at the UN level? Did FCC take over those functions too?
So to me, the State Department is more about working outside of the United States. So this is really more about making sure that the U.S. is complying with its Article 6 obligations to regulate what's happening within our borders economically. So there's always going to be a place for the State Department there, I think. Yeah, back.
Yeah, you're uncomfortable thinking there might be a one-stop shop for rigs, but don't you think that the up and down transportation one-stop shop that the FAA has been providing has been working in these last 20 years? So
Yeah.
One model we know of so far, a good model.
Well, and the FAA has done a really great job, but I think their ambit is just too narrow for what we're talking about. Their jurisdiction ends once you get to space, wherever that line happens to be, which nobody wants to say where the line is. So I think it's outside their purview to regulate orbital activities. But it's a great model. It just, strictly speaking, the FAA is not in that business.
What about the concept of this has to be international? I mean, what sovereign nations, they want to use the same frequency that we use?
So I didn't go down that rabbit hole here, but I'm happy to explain. The FCC is best buddies, if you will, with the International Telecommunications Union, which all countries have signed on to coordinate with things like spectrum allocation. So it's another reason why the Space Bureau would be best positioned, because they've already had a decades-long working relationship with the ITU that does regulate that stuff internationally.
Was that places like North Korea?
I don't know if they signed the ITU treaty. It's an old one, so I'd have to check. I don't know if there was a North Korea when it was originally signed. It might have just been Korea.
During the Cold War, the ITU, the radio regulations were one of the one things that worked between the East and the West. I became a radio operator, and the ITU spectrum was pretty good.
It is. It's one of those things that's just been remarkably consistent and resistant to any sort of geopolitical maneuvering over decades. So, yes.
Are these new policies regulating commercial space activity make any difference between human commercial space activity and robotic and autonomous space activity? Is it one package, or will those be separate?
I think they're two sides of the same coin. So when you've got humans involved, I think OSHA is going to have to get involved at some point. It's a little premature, but I think if you do have a human component to your novel commercial space activity, like orbital construction of a platform, I think OSHA is going to have to get involved eventually, but maybe only for things that are dealing with human components. So it's an argument for doing things with robots because it's less red tape to go through. Yes.
Just walking a little bit closer to what's happening, if the FCC was chosen to do this, that makes me nervous because of the way commissioners have historically been chosen. Just because the chairwoman right now is trying to focus on this topic, that is not a guarantee of what the future chairwoman and chairman might choose to do in this situation. And I was kind of looking for your thoughts on how the selection criteria for commissioners would be changed if they were to take on this portfolio in such an absolute way.
I don't see any political will to change the way that the commissioners are appointed. I think with putting together something like the Space Innovation Agenda, I think the intent is probably to create something that's going to survive her and be sticky in the way that some others have described how to survive a political administration change. But if it got absorbed into the Department of Commerce, the FCC is actually established by Congress based on Congress's constitutional authority to regulate interstate commerce. I think at this point, this is not interstate, this is international. And so once you pull a congressional mandate out of there and it goes over to the executive agency, I think you might see a difference in how the commissioner is chosen because it would be the president instead of Congress picking that person. So, all right. All right, I think we're good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.